If you're new to Vagrant, then I suggest you watch episode number 4 before watching this one. In this episode, we're going to create a custom Vagrant box using Veewee. Veewee is a tool for easily creating custom Vagrant boxes. It provides many virtual machine templates that can be used. I suggest checking out the Veewee GitHub page. It has lots of useful information. You'll need to have VirtualBox, Ruby, and Vagrant installed before you can use Veewee. To install Veewee, I just use gem install Veewee. Veewee integrates with your existing Vagrant install. I think of Veewee as a type of Vagrant plugin. Once you have Veewee installed, Vagrant will have an additional subcommand called Basebox. Before we get started with Veewee, I always like to create a project directory. So as I mentioned earlier, Veewee comes with a bunch of templates. Let's take a look at the Veewee templates. To take a look at the templates that are provided, you can run Vagrant Basebox templates. As you can see, there are quite a few, and there's a wide range of OSs that are supported, including Linux, BSD, Solaris, and even Windows. Since the list is so large, I generally pipe the output to grep. In this episode, we're going to focus on Scientific Linux, or SL for short. We're going to create a SL 6.4 Vagrant box, and we're going to use the SL 6.3 template as a starting point. We're going to run Vagrant Basebox define, what we want to call the new Vagrant box, and the template we want to use. Let's just copy this line and modify it to our needs. So now we have Vagrant Basebox define SL 6.4, the 64-bit version, based off SL 6.3, the 64-bit version. After running this command, we're given a directory structure. Inside that directory structure, there's various configuration files. I should mention that you can run this command now, and it'll give you a working SL 6.3 box. But we want to create a SL 6.4, so we're going to have to go and modify the definition and Kickstart files. Basically just updating a couple lines that point to the install media, changing that from SL 6.3 to SL 6.4. Before we edit the definition and Kickstart files, let me briefly give you an overview of what the directory structure looks like. Located in this directory are files Veewee uses to build our Vagrant box. Most of these files are post-install scripts, but there is also our definition and Kickstart file. You can open your favorite editor, and we're going to review the definition and Kickstart files. In the definition file, there are 3 lines that need to be updated. These reference the install media. You can see the Kickstart file mentioned here, and a little farther down there's the post-install scripts that are referenced. So where do we find the SL 6.4 install media? Let's take a look at the Scientific Linux website. Scientific Linux was put together by a few government labs and various universities. It's also a Red Hat derivative, similar to Red Hat Enterprise Linux or RHEL. I found a download mirror that was geographically close to me. We're going to use the SL 64-bit boot ISO. I'm just going to copy the link, and then we'll use that in our definition and Kickstart files. Okay, armed with our SL boot ISO, we can now update the ISO source, and then we're going to copy the ISO name and update the ISO field. Lastly, we're going to update the ISO MD5. That's it for the definition file. Now let's review the Kickstart file. We're going to update the second line here. This points to the SL 6.4 RPMs. This is a pretty standard Kickstart file. There is one interesting thing at the bottom. A Vagrant user and group will be added, along with the sudoers entry. Okay, let's update the install URL. Just copy and paste from before, replacing the ISO folder with the OS folder. This points to the install packages needed by Kickstart. One last thing before we start building our SL 6.4 box. This step is not required, but I think it's a useful piece of information to have. You can create a directory called ISO. This directory will hold, you guessed it, the ISO images. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to download the ISO that we put into the definition file from the Scientific Linux website. This step is not required, as the Veewee script will notice and download the ISO for you. I thought it would be useful to understand where this lived in the file system hierarchy. Okay, just to recap. We installed Veewee, created a project directory, reviewed the Veewee templates, defined a new box called SL 6.4 64-bit, updated the definition and Kickstart files, and lastly downloaded the install media. Now we're ready to create our new SL 6.4 box. We do this by running Vagrant Basebox build SL64 64-bit. Veewee is pretty clever in that it automates the install. A VirtualBox GUI is even displayed that allows you to watch what is happening along the way. As you can see here, Veewee even simulates keyboard input, pointing the installer at our Kickstart file. Our Kickstart file has been executed. From this point on, it's a pretty straightforward install. I should mention that I sped up the video quite a bit. This process took about 15 minutes, and we shrunk it down to about 30 seconds. The system is going to reboot. At this point, I'm going to minimize the VirtualBox window so we can watch the console output. And then our Veewee post-install scripts mentioned in the definition file are going to be run. These scripts install things like Ruby, Puppet, Chef, and the VirtualBox tools. The Basebox build is totally automated. There is no user input required, but it does take about 15 minutes for the process to complete. Then you are hopefully presented with a message saying the build was successful. If you would like to do any finishing touches, you can use this SSH command to gain remote access. To export the box, we run Vagrant Basebox Export SL 6.4 64-bit. The end result is our SL 6.4 64-bit Vagrant box. I found that this box is a little bit large. I still have some experimenting to do. I'll probably start with a bare bones install and work from there, but this proves the concept works. You can now add this new SL 6.4 64-bit box to Vagrant by running Vagrant box add SL 64 64-bit and our newly created box file. After this, we run Vagrant init SL64 64-bit to initialize our SL 6.4 64-bit box. Then we can run Vagrant up to power on the box. Then let's run Vagrant SSH to connect. Hooray! Looks like we have a working system. Let's check a couple things, like uptime, to make sure this is our newly created box. And let's cat the Red Hat release file. Okay, I'm going to exit, and I'm going to destroy this instance of the VM. Alright, that concludes this episode. Thanks for watching. If you would like to get notified about future episodes, please subscribe to my mailing list. You can do this by going to the Get Notified link in the header and entering your email address. Have questions, comments, or concerns about this episode? What about episode ideas? I'd love to hear your feedback, either good or bad. Shoot me an email, justin@sysadmincasts.com.